Hello, everyone. Okay, so next in the Nancy Drew adventures in Password to Larkspur Lane. So this is a quick recap because we have to, when I say we, I mean me, have to read to get back on track. So basically, last time we have a missing houseman. Nancy nearly got run over by a boat in order to save a child who happened to fall into the water. We have another child who released a gosh darn pigeon from the box, and so far there has not been any retribution because that child needs a timeout. Like they said, don't mess with the pigeon, and what did that kid do? He messed with the gosh darn pigeon and scared it away. And it's only thanks to the fact that the pigeon is nice to Nancy, because it probably remembered, oh, this person was nice to me and probably wants to be led to where my destination is, so I'm just gonna be nice. It was a very nice pigeon. But yeah, Nancy found the Eldridge family, and so Nancy finally has the identity of the missing woman for the most part. Anyway, so we were at an unwelcome gift. Thank goodness. There's a table of contents in the beginning, so I know which page to go to. Okay, so back for more of Password to Larkspur Lane. Chapter 10, An Unwelcome Gift. You girls listen to me, the old lady shouted. The house you want is over in the next township, just outside of Milford. Go right down Elm Road. You can't miss it. The woman standing by the hedge shook her head. I never heard you mention that place before, Mother. The old lady's black eyes snapped. I know lots I don't tell, she said. Well, this is going to be a conversation between mother and daughter later. The girls thanked the two women and drove off excited at the lead. But as they neared the small town of Milford, Bess looked worried. Oh, by the way, Bess and George are following in the story, and we got to see Ned, Bert, and Dave. So that's the other thing I forgot to recap. Moving on. I'm beginning to wish I stayed home, she said. I really don't want to meet any kidnappers. Now don't be a snob, George teased her cousin. It's all right for you to make jokes, Bess replied, but I can't help it if I'm not brave like you two. And actually, it's a good thing she's not, because she's the only... When Nancy's in a difficult situation, she's the one who's like, yeah, maybe we shouldn't do this. Because Nancy's all for, hey, let's do that. And it's like, Nancy, no. Nancy, 9. Nancy, stop. But anyway, moving on. Nancy smiled. I can remember times on some of my cases when you were way ahead of us. I surprised myself, Bess admitted. Nancy spotted the sign marking Elm Road and turned into the narrow, treeless street. There it is, exclaimed George. In the middle of the block was a yard full of bluebells. You mean there it isn't, Nancy said gloomily as she pulled up in front of the white cottage. A faded sign Bluebell house hung by the door. No mansion, no fence, no gate. But whoever lives here must be interested in bluebells, said Bess. Maybe they could help you. Good idea, Nancy said. And the three girls went up the walk to the door. Their knock was answered by a thin young woman carrying an apron. Hello, girls, she said cheerfully. I guess you want to see the china. Come on in. She walked quickly into a room off the hall, beckoning them to follow. Nancy tried to explain, but stopped short at the door of the room. Shelves and tables were filled with flowered china. All hand-painted, the girl said. The prices are marked. Oh, how beautiful, Bess exclaimed. While she and George looked around, Nancy explained to the girl why they had called. There's no place like that around Milford, she said. But have you tried the Brookdale section west of River Heights? I've heard there used to be lots of estates out that way. Nancy thanked her, and Bess bought 3 hand-painted cups and saucers. There's one for each of us, she said when they reached the car. A souvenir of a wild goose chase. It may not have been so hopeless after all, said Nancy, and repeated what the girl had said. George looked thoughtful. You told us Dr. Spire rode about an hour to get to the house. Can't we narrow the search by going only to places that are about an hour from the road where the old sedan was parked? We could, Nancy said, but the chances are the kidnappers drove a little longer than necessary just to confuse the doctor. George grinned. Nancy, you never miss a trick. A further search continued for some time, but without success. Finally, Bess reminded Nancy of the dance that night. We better go home, she advised. See, that's why you have a Bess on your team. Bess remembers things. She remembers the little stuff. Like, I don't know how many times she's like, hey, let's go for lunch, or something like that. This is always why you have a Bess on the team. Hours later, Nancy was seated with Ned on a bench outside the gaily lighted porch of the yacht club. I read that all awkward. Lively music and singing came pulsing out the wide-open doors and windows. On a hunch, I brought something for the chemistry expert, she said, and handed him the envelope containing the bits of paper she had picked up in the woods. I'm no expert, he protested. Ned's eyes filled with mischief. You don't expect me to look at this, do you, when I could be looking at you? Smooth, Ned. Nancy blushed and laughed. She was wearing a simple rose-colored formal, and her hair was piled high with the gardenia tucked in it. Please be serious, she said. I have a hunch that the burning circle is made of fireworks which are carried by someone. I remembered that you once helped make a fireworks display at a college. Ned spilled the bits of paper into his palm. He looked at them carefully. Your hunch is right, Nancy. These are fragments of quick match. What's that? She asked. The fuse which is used to light fireworks. He explained that it was a string coated with a mixture of gunpowder and glue and enclosed in a brown paper tube. Then that's attached to the lances. And what are they? Nancy queried. Paper tubes filled with chemical mixtures which burn different colors. The circle you saw is probably a wooden frame with long nails sticking out of it about an inch apart. The lances are forced upright onto the points of the nails, and the quick match is nailed across the tops of the lances. It's rough to do, he added, because the lances are very hard, and many times the nail goes into your finger instead. Well, does that help you? Yes. If I can find out where the fireworks were bought by whom, I may have a good lead. The rest of the evening was pure fun, and ended with supper on several of the members' yachts moored to the club's dock. While taking their dates home, the three boys invited them to a swimming meet at the camp the next afternoon, and the invitation was accepted. By 1 o'clock, the girls were ready for bed. Bess and George dropped off to sleep at once, but Nancy lay awake. Suddenly she sat up. There had been a noise downstairs. Quickly she put on robe and slippers, then grabbed a flashlight from her suitcase. Slipping past her sleeping friends, Nancy went quietly down the back stairs. At the bottom, she heard a scraping sound in the utility room. Softly, she opened the door and flashed on her light. Caught in the beam was a white-faced, frightened figure on his hands and knees. He looked up. The missing man! We found the missing houseman! Morgan! Nancy exclaimed. What are you doing? Where have you been? I dropped the door key, he stammered. Nancy spotted the key and picked it up. Thank you. I was moving things, feeling around for it. Sorry I disturbed you. Morgan, we've been very worried about you, Nancy said. Won't you please tell me what's wrong? Nothing's wrong, the man said quickly. I'll explain in the morning. He opened the door to his bedroom, stepped inside, and locked the door behind him. Nancy wondered if she should awaken her hostess to report the servant's return, but decided against this. In the morning, before breakfast, Mrs. Corning told the girls Morgan had already talked to her and her husband. She said he had begged forgiveness and had told a rambling story about going to help a friend. I'm afraid it's not true, but we don't want to discharge him, she sighed, and then said, Here, I almost forgot. She handed Nancy the names of the 3 persons who had written letters of recommendation for the housemen. If you don't mind, said Nancy, I'll phone these men after breakfast. An hour later, she came down from the second-floor phone and reported to the Cornings in the living room. Well, what did they say? Asked the old gentleman. None of these people ever heard of Morgan. The couple sat thunderstruck. Then the letters were forged? Said Mrs. Corning. I'm afraid so, Nancy told her. Impossible, snorted Mr. Corning. I remember talking to one of those men on the telephone. You must have spoken to an impostor, said Nancy. But why would Morgan do this? Asked Mrs. Corning. Well, if he has a bad past, the last thing he's gonna need is you to actually talk to real people who can, like, say this guy's bad, or he just doesn't have any good references at all, you know? Like, you know? You know. Maybe his past made it impossible for him to get recommendations any other way, said Nancy. Whoever helped him must feel he has a hold over Morgan. Perhaps that is the friend who has come back into his life. Mrs. Corning said presently, Now that Morgan has returned, maybe it's all over. I doubt it, said Nancy. He's still frightened. Her host spoke up. Morgan's always been honest and a hard worker. I say we give him another chance. Do you agree, Emily? Can you at least figure out what the heck is going on? Like, we're going to believe in you, Morgan. Without getting Morgan's side of the story, we're going to believe in you. You know, when somebody does something odd, you question them about that. Always question them about that. Like, because this kind of stuff has a way of coming about and, like, hurting people. So, always question. His wife nodded. The girl said nothing. After church and lunch, Nancy looked through the advertising pages of the telephone directory for fireworks companies in the area, but found none. As she put the book away, there was a sharp knock on the front door. Nancy went to open it. No one was there, but on the stoop was a long, narrow parcel wrapped in brown paper. It was addressed to Morgan. Suspicious, Nancy went to tell the Cornings about it. Under the circumstances, she said, would you like to open this before Morgan does? No, her hostess said firmly. I feel that's what Morgan's business is his business. Take the parcel to him, Nancy. I'm so mad at the Cornings. I'm so mad. I'm so mad. Helen, where are you? You need to get on your grandparents. With misgivings, she carried the package to the kitchen and handed it to the houseman. He stared at it and began to tremble. With shaking fingers, Morgan removed the string and paper. He seemed lost in thought and unaware that Nancy was still in the room. When Morgan opened the paper and saw the contents, his face turned white and he suddenly slumped to the floor. In the package lay a few stalks of blue larkspur. Chapter 11. A Hazardous Drop. Quickly, Nancy knelt beside the unconscious servant. Morgan, she said urgently, and lightly slapped his cheek. He did not stir. She wet a clean towel at the sink and patted his face. A few moments later, he moaned and muttered, Last warning, tomorrow night. Then his eyes opened. With Nancy's help, he managed to sit up. She called the others, and while Mrs. Corning telephoned the doctor, the girls assisted the man to his room. Mr. Corning seated himself beside the bed, but Morgan would speak to no one. In a short time, Dr. Bennett, an old friend of the family, arrived. He said the houseman had suffered a slight heart attack and ordered him kept quiet. That means no questions, Nancy thought. Darn it! She had been mulling over the significance of the larkspur in the package. She put them in a vase. When the doctor had gone, she led the rest of the group into the living room and told the whole story. Larkspur again, exclaimed George. I don't get it. That's one of the clues in your other case, Nancy, Bess puzzled. Probably the two are connected, the young sleuth replied. She told the Cornings briefly about Mary Eldridge. Bess looked surprised. Why? What could Morgan have to do with the old lady's kidnappers? But Morgan has always been the soul of honesty, protested Mrs. Corning. Perhaps not always, Nancy said gently. I believe he may have a prison record, under another name, of course. It would explain why he needed forged recommendations. Now Adam Thorne wants repayment. Adam Thorne? Exclaimed George. Why him? Because all the years Morgan worked for the Cornings, no one bothered him, but after Adam Thorne broke out of prison, the friendship card arrived, and the blue fire began. Nancy, you are right, but you are also jumping to conclusions without any, connections. But this is why Nancy's a great detective. Mr. Corning stirred uneasily. You spoke of repayment. What did you mean? What do you think she meant? I think Thorne and his gang want to rob this house. Remember, the friendship card had no written message on it, but the picture showed a cottage with the door open. I see, said Bess. That was the message. Open the door. Mrs. Corning was pale. Do you know when it is to be? Tomorrow night, I think, replied Nancy. I believe the Larkspur was a signal to Morgan, his last chance to cooperate. Probably the gang showed the blue fire and abducted Morgan to intimidate him. Mr. Corning's face flushed with anger. Scoundrels! We'll get the police at once. Wait, said Nancy. This is only a theory. If we hold off until tomorrow night, we'll see if we're right. Maybe we can catch the thieves red-handed and solve both cases at once. But in the meantime, George said worriedly, Morgan may have told the gang where you are. Nancy nodded. Yes, I've thought of that. When Mr. Drew telephoned her a few minutes later, he had disquieting news. The lawyer had reported to police before flying to Chicago and asked them to keep in touch with him. Lieutenant Mulligan informed me they had not been able to trace the kidnap car. Also, when they arrived at the Tooker estate, it was deserted. The gang took the pigeons. I understand, Dad. My visit forced them to run. They'll be more eager than ever to get me out of the picture. An hour later, Nancy, Ned, and their friends were watching the swimming races at Camp Hiawatha. In the fun and excitement, she found it hard to remember the threat of danger. Cheers and singing filled the air as the young campers put all their high-spirited enthusiasm into the contests. Now you know something bad's going to happen. I just feel it. I feel something bad's going to happen. When the swimming meet was over, she said, It was great, Ned. Your little boys did so well. Thanks, he said proudly. Now we can go swimming. Bert and Dave and I have free time. The boys showed their guests where to change into suits they had brought, then met them at the water's edge. Tons of ocean sand had been transported over land to make a beach for the camp. A float was moored a few rods from shore with a tower and a springboard for diving. The three couples swam out to the float on which a dozen young people were frolicking. Ned introduced everyone. Oh, you're the detective, said one boy playfully, shielding his face with one arm. Nancy laughed. I promise not to delve into any of your secrets. George called, But watch out, my friend. Suddenly Ned asked, How about a little diving? One by one, the group went off the high board. Presently, it became an impromptu meet. Nancy, show them that new one you just learned, Bess urged. I'll try, she smiled, but I may flop. As everyone watched, Nancy bounced upside down on the edge of the board for a breathtaking moment, then thrust herself off. Her body revolved in the air and straightened out so that her pointed toes cleaved the water like a knife. Down she plunged into the green waters of the lake, then bobbed to the surface to hear the cheers of the spectators. Wonderful! Perfect! Panting, Nancy climbed back onto the float. As she threw herself down in the sun to rest, Ned came over. That was a beauty, Nancy. Just luck, she insisted. Later, when Nancy swam ashore with her friends, she was met by Mr. Dennis, the camp director. Great diving exhibition, young lady. How would you like a job as counselor? Thank you, Nancy said, smiling, but I already have a job. Well, you and your friends stayed at dinner, the man said cordially, and the evening camp. As he walked away, a bugle sounded. We fellows must go. I can't even figure out the wording for Dave. We'll try this sound. We fellows must go now, said Dave, but we'll take you home tonight after taps. Nancy called Mrs. Corning to tell her they would not be home for dinner. Then the girls went to the guest dining hall. During the meal, two small boys appeared at the table with their arms full of parkas. Ned and Dave and Bert sent you their coats, piped the tallest. 'Cause you didn't bring yours, said the other. They put the jackets out on an empty chair and fled as the girls thanked them. It grew chilly after dinner, and the trio were glad to put on the parkas and pull up the hoods. George flapped her dangling sleeves. What a great fit this is! Now you can't tell us apart, said Bess. When it was dark, a long line of singing boys filed up a hill behind the camp. The girls followed their bobbing flashlights. At the top, the three stopped to look around. The wooded hill sloped steeply to a rocky drop-off. 15 feet below it was a huge bonfire. The girls watched the campers wind slowly down the path and saw that the first ones were already seated on another slope to the far side of the fire. Come on, said Nancy, but watch your step. She went first, with George beside her and Bess on the right. As they picked their way downward, they could hear the giant blaze crackling. Some smoke billowed up, and Bess paused, coughing. Suddenly, a powerful push from behind knocked Bess off her feet. And there it is! Screaming, she began to roll down the hill toward the drop-off in the leaping flames. Oh no! Will we be able to save Bess in time? Chapter 12, The Crystal Garden. Bess! George exclaimed, horror-stricken. She'll roll into the fire! Nancy scrambled down the hill, George beside her. With a flying leap, she threw herself on Bess and stopped her from rolling. At the same time, George skidded down and caught one of her cousin's flailing arms. The girls lay gasping only a few feet from the drop-off and the bonfire below. Bess, Nancy whispered, are you hurt? No, Bess said shakily. Oh, Nancy, somebody push me. If you and George hadn't... Nancy looked grim. I think someone mistook you for me, and I don't want him to know he was wrong. As she spoke, 3 counselors hurried down the hill toward them, calling, What happened? Anybody hurt? Nancy squeezed George's hand. We'll pretend I am, she whispered, then closed her eyes. Yes, George called out. Nancy Drew, please hurry. I'm afraid it's bad. She's unconscious, quavered Bess. Good acting, George and Bess. Moments later, a husky counselor was carrying Nancy up the hill while one of his companions ran ahead for the camp doctor. And get Ned Nickerson, George called. 40 minutes later, Ned tenderly placed Nancy on the Corning's living room couch as Helen's grandmother closed the draperies. Okay, said Ned. All clear. Only then did Nancy open her eyes and sit up. You're some actress, young lady. Oh, wait, no, that's Mr. Corning. Sorry. You're some actress, young lady, said Mr. Corning. Nancy smiled. I didn't have to do anything. Ned and Bess and George were the real actors. Bess giggled. And the camp director and the doctor were good actors, too. Mr. Dennis insisted that we use his station wagon to bring Nancy home. I just hope we fooled the one who pushed Bess, said Nancy. Morgan must have told the gang you were here, said George, and one of them trailed us to the camp, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. Ned frowned. Someone probably is still watching this house. To make her act look really good, we ought to call the doctor for Nancy. Mrs. Corning hurried off to put in the call. Soon she returned, and she reported that Dr. Bennett would be glad to cooperate. Nancy chuckled. He'll make the gang think I'm out of action. Then they'll pay no more attention to me, and I can work freely. George spoke up. I have a suggestion. If someone is watching this house, he'll probably plan to speak to Morgan. How about Bess and me letting ourselves out the back door and watching? I'll do it, Ned offered. No, Mr. Corning said. That would look too suspicious. I often take a little stroll outside before going to bed. In a few minutes, one of you can follow me. While I'm out there, no gangster will come out to talk to Morgan through the window. He waved aside objections and left the room. His wife said weirdly, Well, I hope everything will be all right. But suppose they strike here tomorrow night? I have a plan, Nancy replied, if Ned and Bert and Dave will help us. Sure we will, said Ned. It's not our night off, but I know 3 fellows will switch with us. The thieves probably will go for the safe, said Bess. Mrs. Corning shook her head. I'm afraid they're after something very special. Come, she added, seeing the questioning expressions of her guests. I'll show you. As their hostess led the way down the hall, Nancy quietly outlined her plan to Ned. I'll tell the others later. Across the hall from the kitchen, Mrs. Corning opened a door and flicked a wall switch. The room remained dark, but at the far side a tall glass cabinet lighted up. Bess gasped. Oh, how beautiful! She and the others stared amazed. Inside was a sparkling array of crystal flowers and butterflies set on shelves lined with black velvet. My husband gave me one of each on our wedding anniversaries, Mrs. Corning explained as she led them to the case. They are made in France. Every flower contains at least one valuable jewel. Nancy noted a ruby glowing in the heart of a rose and a topaz set in a daffodil. The butterflies had diamonds for eyes. How could the thieves have heard about these? George asked. My crystal garden was written up in a magazine some time ago, Mrs. Corning replied. Nancy examined the case carefully. Do you have a key for this? Mrs. Corning showed her a tiny gold one which she wore on a chain around her neck. Just then the doctor arrived. He listened to the story of what happened, then went to check on Morgan, who was much better. When leaving, Dr. Bennett called back through the open door for the benefit of any outside listener. Miss Drew must remain in bed for at least 48 hours. Ned followed the doctor and went to join Mr. Corning. Inside the house, Nancy said to her friends, Dr. Bennett played his part well. Then she told them her plans for the next day. Half an hour later, Mr. Corning and Ned reported no prowler near Morgan's window. Ned said good night and returned to Camp Hiawatha. Shortly before dawn, Nancy ate a light-hearted breakfast, then slipped into, light breakfast? I don't know why I said light-hearted, but anyway, light breakfast, then slipped into the garage and hid behind the front seat of her car. At 8 o'clock, the other girls came out with a packet of sandwiches. George took the wheel and they drove off. When she was sure they were not being followed, George pulled to the side of the road and Nancy took the driver's seat. Now for the Larkspur house, she said happily. But where is it? Bess asked. Nancy said that since the Tucker estate lay southeast of River Heights and the Pigeon and airplane both flew over it, the other headquarters were probably to the northwest. I'll try that anyway. After a while, the road narrowed and there were no houses to be seen. The countryside was generously sprinkled with patches of woodland and open fields. The girls explored every side road. Most of these were merely lumber trails which ended within a short distance. At other times, the searchers found a cabin and inquired if there was a sanatorium in the neighborhood. The answer was always no, and again Nancy would go on. Stopping only to eat their sandwiches, the girls rode all day exploring the network of winding lanes. All three were tired, their nerves tense with the strain of being constantly on the alert. Finally, Nancy glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 10 minutes past 5, she said. We'd better go back. Nancy turned the car and began retracing the route to the main highway. Suddenly, she pressed down on the brake and they stopped short. Sorry, Nancy said, but we just passed a sign that I didn't see when we drove along here before. She backed a dozen feet and halted opposite a narrow dirt road. Nailed to a tree was a crude hand-lettered board, L.S. Lane. What about it? Bess asked. That probably leads to the cabin of a lumberman whose name is L.S. Lane. And on the other hand, said Nancy, it could mean Larkspur Lane and be a guide for the crooks. It's worth investigating, George remarked. Nancy turned into the narrow roadway, wide enough for only one car. But here and there, the side bank had been cut to allow a vehicle to park while another passed it. Proceeding cautiously over ruts and bumps, Nancy presently pulled into one of the wider places on the right. She stopped the car close to the trees. This might be the right place, so we better go on foot, Nancy said. She led the way among the trees, keeping parallel with the road. The girls trudged through the underbrush for nearly a quarter of a mile, but saw nothing unusual. The only sounds were the crackle of twigs breaking underfoot. Suddenly, Nancy halted. Look! She exclaimed softly. Larkspur! A dozen yards ahead, the trees ended. Just beyond was a high wire mesh fence. Inside it grew a long border of exquisite tall larkspur. To the girls' left, a large gate across the lane shut off the entrance to the grounds. Next to it stood a small brown lodge. This is it, Nancy whispered gleefully, and her friends nodded. Beyond the gate, the ground sloped gently. A gravel roadway led to the top of the rise, where a large white colonial dwelling with a broad veranda was visible among some trees. It's a beautiful place, Beth said in a low voice. I can't believe crooks live here. We'll soon find out, said Nancy. Cautiously, the three girls moved forward, taking advantage of every tree trunk and bush for concealment. There was no sign of habitation. If anyone was inside the gatehouse, he was not to be seen at the moment. Then, for an instant, a flash of white appeared in the distance near the brow of the hill. Did you see that? George whispered tensely. I'm sure it was a nurse's uniform. Listen, do you hear a plane? Nancy asked. The girls peered upward. Several minutes passed before the aircraft became visible. Then it shot overhead, flying low. It's the same type of plane that wounded the bird, Nancy said quickly. And it's like the one the hotel manager said flew into the Tucker estate. Yes, there's that flying horse on the fuselage. This is the place. Sure enough, said George. Down he goes. The landing field must be behind the house. The plane dipped low, lost altitude rapidly, and vanished behind the roof of the mansion. Now what do we do? Bess asked. There's only one thing left, Nancy answered. Somehow we must get inside. Chapter 13. Baiting a Thief. George frowned. You're not going to try getting into this place now, are you? No, said Nancy. I'd probably end up a prisoner. She thought of the old lady who was being held against her will. It's getting late, Bess put in. We'd better go back to the Cornings. Yes, Nancy added reluctantly. We have our work cut out for us tonight. Why don't you just tell the police where the sanatorium is? Bess asked nervously. Let them rescue Mrs. Eldridge. Nancy shook her head. We must get her to safety before the police raid starts. Otherwise the gang might harm the poor woman to keep her from talking. We'll have to find out exactly where they're keeping her prisoner in the mansion. It's such a big house, Beth said gloomily. Mrs. Eldridge might be hard to find. It's also possible she's not here anymore, George said. The gang knows the police are after them, and they may have moved her. When they reached the car, Nancy hid in the back again, and George drove. At the Cornings, Bess was asked to go in first and make sure Morgan was in his room. No use having him learn my secret, Nancy remarked. Thorne might get it out of him before I'm ready to have it known. Learning the coast was clear, she scooted up to her room. Mrs. Corning had dinner ready, so a tray was prepared for Nancy. The others ate in the dining room, then went upstairs. Now tell us your plan for capturing the thieves as they come, Mr. Corning urged. Nancy said, Here it is. First, remember that the Crystal Garden Room has 2 doors. One to the hall, the other to the TV room. Each has a key that's now on the inside. Her host nodded. Nancy went on. The boys will be outside. Dave will be watching in the shrubs bordering the flagstone area, Bert at the top of the patch which leads to the dock, and Ned on the garage roof. As soon as the thief, or thieves, enters the house, Ned will signal with a walkie-talkie to Mr. Dennis at the camp, and he will call the police. Meanwhile, Bert and Dave will be ready to tackle anybody watching on the outside. We girls will lock in the intruders in the crystal room. But suppose they see you, Mrs. Corning asked. They won't, said Nancy. Bess and George will hide across the hall in the kitchen. I'll be in the TV room. As soon as the thieves enter, I'll lock the adjoining door. At the same time, the girls will slip across the hall and quietly lock that door. Mr. Corning asked what he and his wife should do. I suggest you go to your room as usual, Nancy replied. That will cause less suspicion. At 9 o'clock, the lights were put out on the first floor. The couple retired, and the girls took their posts. Nancy held the door to the crystal room open a crack, put the key on the outside of the lock, and watched. It seemed that she stood for ages before the other door opened. There was a click, and the light went on in the glass cabinet. Nancy gripped the key, ready to shut the door. Suddenly she froze. Only one figure approached the cabinet. Morgan! A thief! He was carrying a large suitcase, which he put on the floor. Nancy watched, hardly daring to breathe, as he took a small tool from his pocket and picked at the cabinet lock. A few minutes later, he pulled the glass door open. Then he swung back the lid to the suitcase. Nancy saw that it was divided into compartments and heavily padded with velvet. A special carrying case, she thought. As the man's trembling hands reached toward his fragile crystal flower, he suddenly drew back. No, he whispered hoarsely. I can't do it. He buried his face in his hands with a sob. Nancy hurried to his side. Morgan, she said softly. The man whirled and gave a gasp. Don't be afraid, she said quickly. Let me help you. He groaned and sank into a chair beside the cabinet. How can you know all this? I know part of it, she replied. Where's the gang? You were to let them in, weren't you? The man stared at her, amazed. Yes, but Thorne changed his mind. He said I should steal the crystal flowers and deliver them in the special case he gave me. I used to be pretty good at lock-picking, he added, flushing miserably. That's how Thorne got his hold over you, isn't it? And asked Nancy. He knew you'd been in prison, and he helped forge your references. The houseman nodded. I wanted to go straight, and I did. I wouldn't have the Cornings for anything, but Thorne, he wouldn't leave me alone. Kidnapped me. Held me on a big estate. Said the Larkspur would be the signal for this theft. I'd have to deliver, or else. There's a Mrs. Eldridge being held prisoner there, too, said Nancy. Did you see her? Eldridge, Morgan repeated. I think I heard the name, but suddenly he broke off. Listen, there they are. The sound of a low whistle came from outside. Nancy flew to the switch and snapped off the light in the crystal case. I'll close it, Morgan whispered. The door clicked shut. What shall I do? He stammered. Listen, Nancy said quickly. We'll have to get them in here. I have a trap set, but you must go out and tell the men you need help, that you're too weak to carry all the loot. They never believe me. I'm no good at acting. There must be some way to get them in here, Nancy declared. Suppose you just don't go out. Morgan gave a bitter laugh. They'll go away. And then in a day or so I'll disappear and never come back. Thorne won't see to that. He won't stand for any double-cross. Nancy had an idea. Come with me. She led the way into the hall. At once the kitchen door opened. What's up? George whispered. Where's the gang? Nancy drew Morgan into the dark kitchen and explained to the girls. But I thought of a way to lure the gang into the house, she said. If they find out I wasn't injured and I'm still working on this case, they'll come after me. Bess caught her breath. You don't mean you'd let them know? Morgan will tell them, said Nancy. Bess, you stay here and George will take over the door of the TV room. I'll go out with Morgan. If they don't believe him, I'll let them see me and then run in here. That should do it. No, said the houseman. I won't let you, Miss Drew. Adam Thorne is dangerous. He will stop at nothing. It's too big a risk for you. Nancy about to do something stupid, cliche. She's about to do something really stupid and dangerous. Oh man, this is Secret of the Little Clock all over again. I'm not afraid, said Nancy. Suddenly Morgan darted away and ran through the utility room. Nancy dashed after him, calling, Morgan, come back. No, he called. I'm telling Thorne I won't do it. I don't care what happens to me. Nancy raced outside and grasped the panting man. Thorne, he called. I won't do it. Morgan, Nancy cried frantically. Come inside. An instant later, powerful hands gripped Nancy's shoulders and swung her away from the houseman. She reeled and fell backward in the darkness. Nancy struck the gravel driveway hard and blacked out. Well, things did not go the way that was planned. Chapter 14. The Matching Necklace. As Nancy's eyes fluttered open, she saw Bess's anxious face bending over her. Oh, thank goodness, Bess exclaimed. She's coming too. George and Mrs. Corning stood at the other side of the bed. You're in your room, dear, said Mrs. Corning. How do you feel? Nancy sat up, frowning. My head aches, but otherwise I'm all right. What happened? The boys found you on the driveway, said George. The gang got away. She explained that the boys had seen 3 men scuffling, and finally one had been carried off through the woods. By the time the boys had rescued Nancy, their search for the others was hopeless. They took Morgan, then? Nancy asked. I was afraid of that. She told how she had been pulled away from the houseman. Lucky the thug didn't know it was you, said George, or you'd have been kidnapped too. The boys are waiting in the kitchen, Bess put in. I'll go down and tell them you're awake. Let's all go, said Nancy. I think I could do with a glass of milk and some crackers, if you don't mind, Mrs. Corning. The woman's face broke into a smile, and she said, That's the best news I've heard yet. Now I know you're feeling better. As Bess and George served cake and glasses of milk, Nancy and the boys exchanged stories. Dave raised his glass of milk. Here's to General Drew. The others echoed the toast enthusiastically. I guess I wasn't such a good general tonight, said Nancy. I certainly lost the battle. The campaign's not over, Bert told her cheerfully. Ned smiled and patted Nancy's shoulder. Better luck tomorrow. Mrs. Corning cleared her throat. Nancy, dear, I'm afraid we had better... Oh, please, Mrs. Corning, I know what you're going to say. That I better give up the case. But please give me another day to find out exactly what's going on at Larkspur Lane. Ned and the others backed up Nancy's plea. Mrs. Corning hesitated. Well, all right, but we can't wait longer than tomorrow night. I'll do my best to solve the mystery by then, Nancy said quietly. To herself she added, and no mistakes, Nancy Drew. Next morning, the girls again started out early. As before, Nancy hid in the back of the car and George drove. The sky was overcast, but Nancy's spirits were light. Some miles from the lake, she took the wheel, her eyes shining with excitement. I don't see how you can be so cheerful, Bess grumbled. You were knocked out last night, and now you're going into more danger. Right, Bess? Bess being common sense right here. Nancy smiled. I never felt better. Familiar with the way now, she was able to make good time to the spot where the sign L.S. Lane marked the battle line. We're in enemy territory now, she remarked. From now on, caution must be our password. Nancy drove past the half-concealed driveway and into the woods, where she parked the car behind a tangle of creeper and bittersweet. No one will notice it here, Nancy said. Now let's strike through the woods ahead and see how close we can come to the house without using the road. Cautiously, the girls worked their way around bramble and bush until the roof of the gatehouse came into view. They crept closer and looks of dismay came over their faces. Tilted back in a chair against the gatepost was a man who Nancy assumed was the gatekeeper. At his feet lay a brindled Great Dane, his tongue lolling and his eyes alert. Nancy gasped. "That's the beast that tackled me at the flower show," she whispered. "Let's hope he doesn't scent us." George said, "There's certainly no chance of getting in here. Let's go on." Nancy led the way to the right, still well within the trees, always keeping the tall fence with its border of larkspur in view. After trudging through the woods for a quarter of a mile, the girls found that the fence turned to the left. It continued in a straight line up the shallow slope along the flower-lined enclosure. "Ugh, it's rough traveling," Beth shuddered. "I'm afraid of snakes." "Want to wait here?" George asked. "I certainly do not," Beth retorted. "I'd be scared to death by myself." Smothering her fears, Beth followed Nancy and George through the tangled undergrowth. At one point, they came to a place where a clump of trees partially concealed the house. Nancy called a halt for rest and consultation. She and George sat down. "This wouldn't be a good spot to climb the fence," George observed, leaning back on her elbows. "You rip your skirt on that barbed wire." Nancy looked at her in surprise. You do more than that, don't you see?" she asked, pointing to the top of the enclosure. "I see a fence and 2 strands of barbed wire stretching along the top," George replied. "Notice how the wire is fastened to the supporting posts. It's attached to little porcelain knobs. What does that have to do with it? Those knobs are insulators, which means the wire is charged with electricity. If you touch it, you will probably set off an alarm and get a bad shock besides. You could be killed." George gave a low whistle. "It's a regular fort," said Bess. "Yet how peaceful it all looks." Through the wire fence, the girls could see other flower gardens, occasional clumps of trees, and the view of the rear of the gatehouse. It was truly a lovely spot, except for the sinister strands of charged wire. "Rested?" Nancy asked. "Let's go." Since they were now approaching the house, the girls moved even more warily. Beth stepped gingerly, afraid of putting her foot down on a snake. "It would be just like those people to let a couple of thousand rattlesnakes and copperheads loose around here," Beth muttered. "Ugh!" The Regal cried suddenly and jumped sideways, clutching at her cousin. Caught off balance, George stumbled and fell, giving a muffled yelp. "What happened?" Nancy whispered excitedly, turning back to them. "I stepped into a hole and I think my ankle is sprained," George said, her face white. "Way to go, Bess." Moving on. Nancy's heart sank. If any of them should become helplessly injured, detection would certainly follow. "Oh, it's all my fault," whispered Bess. "I'm sorry, George. I thought I stepped onto something alive." Her eyes filled with tears. George managed to grin. "Take it easy. I'm not dying." Nancy knelt beside George and with deft fingers felt the injured ankle, wishing that Dr. Spire were with them now. "I'm sure it's not broken," she said softly. George rubbed her ankle gingerly. "Go on, you two. I'll wait for you here." "You sure you're all right?" Nancy asked. "Yes, go on, please." Nancy and Bess resumed their cautious advance to the top of the rise. There they had a full view of all the grounds. Surrounding the house was a wide lawn with gravelled walks and flower beds. In the rear was a huge meadow which Nancy surmised was used as a landing field for the airplane. The craft was not in sight. Just below the brow of the hill, and connected with the house by a long arbor, was a group of outbuildings. A carriage house evidently converted into a garage, a good-sized barn, and a chicken yard. "Listen," Nancy said, raising a finger. "I heard cooing." "Pigeons!" Bess exclaimed. The girls moved ahead until they were behind the carriage house, where they saw a small wooden building which had no window on their side. Here they rested in the shade until aroused by a soft cooing and the sound of a man's voice. "You're getting better," the listeners heard through the wooden walls. "I guess you'll be able to work again if we keep you warm with this electric light. That'll cure you." There was more cooing. Then the unseen man said, "You ought to be ashamed taking a couple of days getting to the boss's place and arriving there lame at that. And why did you go to Drew's, you half-witted barnyard goose?" The door closed and all was silent. Well, if I was a pigeon, I would be screaming back, "You kicked me out the plane, and I got injured by the gosh darn plane! At least the Drew girl was nice!" That's what I would say if I was a pigeon. But seriously though, like, oh, the pigeon's at fault. You guys didn't take good care of the pigeon, and I think wasn't there a first pigeon? Like I think was it Mulligan? No, it wasn't Mulligan. It was I forget what it's called, but it was like the pigeon place. The official place for like homing pigeons, and there was one pigeon that was found that was dead and had a message, an unverified, unlicensed message, because I think the pigeons are supposed to be licensed in some kind of way. And so they found that one, and then here comes the second one. So it's like, yeah, no, you guys don't take care of these birds at all. But anyway, a door closed and all was silent. Did you hear what that man said? Bess asked with a catch in her voice. He mentioned your name. Yes, that was the man I met at Toker's estate. I recognized his voice, Missy said as she walked ahead. Once past the outbuildings, the girl saw a lichen-covered sundial surrounded by a grassy court. In it stood a number of wheelchairs, each occupied by an old lady. A large woman in a nurse's uniform had her back to the girls. She seemed to be administering to one of the elderly women. It looks like a real nursing home, Bess whispered. Perhaps our suspicions are all wrong. Nancy put a finger to her lips. The nurse turned and walked toward the fence. That's the woman who stole my handbag, Nancy exclaimed softly. The one who took the bracelet? Yes. She's in league with Thorne and Tooker, I feel sure. One of those old ladies may be Mrs. Eldridge, Bess said. But how can we find out? I don't know yet, but I'll think of something, Nancy replied. Meanwhile, we better go back and help George to the car. If she were discovered, she'd have no way to escape. The girls hurried back to their companion, and the three made their way down the hill. George limped along as quickly as she could, but progress was slow. When they had nearly reached the gatehouse, the girls paused, and George sat down on a stump to rest. Suddenly, Nancy seized Bess's arm and pointed among the trees. On the other side of the wire barrier was an old woman dozing in a wheelchair. Stay here, Nancy whispered. I'm going closer. Bess clung to her friend's arm. No! Suppose they catch you! I must talk to that old lady, said Nancy. She may be able to help us. Nancy crept cautiously toward the fence. When she was a few feet away, still screened by bushes, she stifled a gasp. The elderly lady wore a necklace which looked like the gold bracelet Dr. Spire had given Nancy as a clue. The missing Mrs. Eldridge, Nancy murmured excitedly. She found Mrs. Eldridge! Woo! So, it looks like I might be able to finish chapter 15, so it looks like we got caught up. But I don't know if I'll be able to get on to chapter 16. Anyway, back to reading. Chapter 15, Daring Plans. Do I dare go closer? Is that even a question, Nancy drew? Nancy wondered, watching the woman behind the fence. Just then an old lady awakened and for a moment sat up straight in her wheelchair. Oh dear, she said. I guess I dreamed I was. Her wrinkled chin twitched and she leaned back with closed eyes. Tears crept from under her lids. Nancy was about to speak when she spotted a white figure hurrying down the hill. The nurse. So there you are, she said harshly, drawing near the old woman. I thought so. Trying to hide again. A sob escaped the elderly patient. Come now, stop that crying, the nurse commanded. If you act like a baby, you ought to be treated like one. With ginger care and love? The old lady lifted a fragile blue-veined hand in protest, but let it drop limply. Very well, Mistress Contrary, you may sit there for half an hour, the nurse snapped. Lucky for you, I'm tender-hearted, or I'd take some of your privileges away. See that you're here when I come back. She strode up the hill. As the patient closed her eyes wearily, Nancy edged closer. Mrs. Eldridge! Mrs. Eldridge! The old lady's eyes snapped open, and she looked wildly about her. Here I am on the other side of the fence, behind the trees, Nancy said. Listen closely. I will bring you help. How do you know my name? Who are you? Mrs. Eldridge whispered. Nancy moved closer. Quickly she told the woman who she was, then explained how she had identified her. Mrs. Eldridge clasped her thin hands. Bless you, child, she said, but you can do nothing. Yes, we can, said Nancy, speaking with confidence, but you must be brave and ready to follow instructions. Bess and George had moved up to Nancy, who quickly introduced them. Well, I'll help you, Mrs. Eldridge, Bess said. You can trust Nancy, George spoke cheerfully despite the pain on her ankle. The old woman smiled. What brave young girls. Her chin lifted and a glint came into her eyes. All right, I'll do my part. Nancy glanced uneasily up the hill. We'd better stay out of sight while we're talking. The girls stepped back and crouched down behind the bush. Tell us where your room is, Bess urged. We'll get you out, then call the police and they can rush the place. No, no, exclaimed Mrs. Eldridge. We've all been warned that if strangers try to enter the grounds, we'll be locked in the cellar. The police would find you, George said. Yes, but some of the women here are heart cases. Many of them could not stand the shock. Hush, Dr. Bell is coming. Bell, thought Nancy, recalling the Blue Bell code message. Quickly the girls slipped back among the trees and watched. Striding down the slope was a tall, distinguished-looking man in a black suit. He had smooth gray hair and a pointed beard. He spoke in honeyed tones to the old woman. Well, well, what has upset your patient? He asked, bending over and gallantly kissing her hand. I'm afraid you fret too much. However, I must tell Miss Tyson to be less strict with our favorite guest. Shall I call Luther and have him wheel you through the gardens? No, just leave me alone, Mrs. Eldridge sighed. Yes, that is what you need. Rest and quiet. Dr. Bell agreed. Dr. Bell. It's Dr. Bell. Dr. Bell agreed. But, he went on, we must talk business. Shall we get over that little matter of signing the transfer papers now? Your proposition is nothing short of robbery, and I will not consent, Mrs. Eldridge replied, sitting bolt upright. Dear me, how harsh you are, Dr. Bell said soothingly. When you came here, you had every confidence in me. You entered this place of your own accord. You didn't give your relatives any idea where you were going. Didn't you agree to that as part of your treatment? Fool that I was, yes, snapped Mrs. Eldridge. But you haven't kept your part of the bargain to me or to any of the other ladies. You promised a special secret treatment. So secret you don't want anybody to know about it. That's why you have this isolated place. The special treatment to restore your youthful vigor isn't ready yet, Dr. Bell replied. But it will be very expensive. I must have the extra money now. Oh, Nancy thought, he's undoubtedly a fraud. Yes, he is. I demand that you let me go, Mrs. Eldridge cried out. We can't do that, Dr. Bell said. It would discredit our sanatorium to have a person leave in a poor state of health. Besides, I have your signed declaration that you are a patient here of your own accord, and you agree to remain as long as I think necessary. Naturally, I forbid you to go. Mrs. Eldridge glanced quickly toward the woods where the girls were concealed. In a loud, clear voice, she said, You wish me to sign over to you many thousands of dollars in addition to the $3,000 I already paid you. And why not? Dr. Bell retorted irritably. There are other patients whom I've charged more. Well, I suppose that once the papers are signed I won't live very long, the old lady said meaningfully. You will feel like a girl again, Dr. Bell replied. I'd rather live without youthful vigor and be out of here, Miss Eldridge said, closing her eyes. I won't sign a thing. If you should kill me, you won't get a cent. That's all. I wish you would go. I am very tired. Nancy saw the doctor's face turned red. His beard seemed to bristle and his eyes blazed with rage. You'll sing a different tune if you don't do as I say, he fumed. I've wasted enough time on you. I will give you until 9 o'clock tonight to come to your senses. Oh, you are a brute, Mrs. Eldridge cried. If only some good angel would come to my little room in that hot south corner on the 3rd floor and rescue me. Say, what are you talking about? Dr. Bell asked, looking at him suspiciously. You don't think any angels are listening to your careful directions, do you? The girls could not help grinning. Dr. Bell turned and shouted, Luther! A man in a white uniform came out of the gatehouse. Take Mrs. Eldridge to the porch, the doctor snapped. Any word about the new patient? A message arrived by Bird X that she will be here at 9, the attendant said with a wink as he wheeled Mrs. Eldridge away. Swiftly, the girls made their way toward the car. Nancy took the wheel and headed for the highway. As they drove along, the sun broke through the overcast. We're going to Glenville, she said. It's about 5 miles from here. George can see a doctor there. What about Mrs. Eldridge? Bess asked. No plan yet, Nancy said tersely, but I'm thinking. Her companions asked no more questions. When they reached the small town, Bess went with George while Nancy telephoned Ned from the drugstore. She told him what had happened and alerted him to his part in the plan she had devised. "You can count on me," he said. An hour later, the girls met in a sandwich shop for a late lunch. "My ankle isn't sprained," George reported. "The doctor put on a bandage and it feels better." "Good," said Nancy. "Are you ready for danger?" she asked soberly. "Of course we are," George answered steadily. "Anything to get these poor old ladies free and home to their families," Bess added. "Then right after we eat, I'm going shopping while you two hire a black sedan. You may have to ride to another town for it, so let's meet here about 5. Then I'll tell you the plan." At the appointed time, Nancy came hurrying down the street, her arms filled with packages. A black sedan was parked at the curb behind her convertible where Bess and George were watching. "What did you buy?" George asked in amazement. Nancy grinned. "Black Oxfords, a black hat with a heavy veil, gray gloves, and a long black coat much too big for me." George's eyes grew wide. "Nancy, you're going to dress up like an old lady." "That's right. I'll be that new patient who's supposed to arrive at 9 o'clock. Only I'll be there early." Bess stared at the parcels Nancy was holding. "What's in that fifth bag?" "A nurse's uniform and a pair of horn-rimmed glasses for you," said Nancy. Bess gasped. "Me?" "Yes, you'll have to drive the car into the sanatorium grounds," Nancy replied. "Oh, my goodness," was all Bess could say. Immediately George offered to go instead, but Nancy said no. You never can tell what will happen," she said. "With that bad ankle, you wouldn't be able to run if it should be necessary." Nancy put the packages in the convertible and suggested that they eat supper. They found a small restaurant on a side street and ordered hot sandwiches and milk. "What's my part in the plan?" George asked. "I want you to stay with the convertible, in the clearing where we hid it before," Nancy said. "Bess may need your help when she brings Mrs. Eldridge out." George nodded. "I see. I'll play it cool." "But what about you, Nancy?" asked Bess. "You're not going to stay in that awful place." "Yes, we must get Mrs. Eldridge out before 9 o'clock. After that, I'll give the signal for the rescue of the others. A pigeon will carry it to the deserted Tooker estate where Ned is stationed." Nancy glanced at her watch. "There's no more time to talk now. We must get started." With George driving the convertible and Nancy the sedan, they returned to the clearing near Larkspur Lane. There, Bess changed into the nurse uniform, and Nancy put her costume over her own clothes. Bess, wearing horn-rimmed glasses, looked stern in her white uniform and cap. Nancy seemed small and frail in the long black coat and heavily veiled hat. "I'd never know you," George exclaimed. 10 minutes later, in the gathering dusk, the sedan reached the gatehouse. "Now remember to give the password," Nancy whispered. Trembling, Bess halted the car in front of the gate as the gatekeeper appeared and chained his Great Dane securely. The huge dog strained at his leash and barked furiously. His master advanced toward the girls. Suppose the password had been changed, Nancy thought fearfully. "What's the good word?" demanded the watchman hoarsely, stepping closer. "Singing horses," Bess whispered, quaking. So we will end here. It's almost an hour. Next time we'll actually finish the story. So it's about to be action-packed. Nancy is pretending to be an elderly woman, one of the elderly patients that is supposed to be arriving, but Nancy's like, "I'm going to pretend that I am the same woman and coming early." Yeah. So that's it. But Mrs. Aldrich has been found. Morgan has been kidnapped, so we gotta figure out what to do about Morgan. It seems like the Nancy Drew crew has forgotten about Morgan right now. Like, they're like, "We gotta save Mrs. Eldridge." Nothing about trying to track down Morgan and figure out where he is, kind of thing. You know. The sad thing is, if he had cooperated, they probably would have gotten quite a bit of the gang. And honestly, I wish Nancy had called the police. I understand why she didn't. what she said was just a theory, and if it turned out to be wrong, you know, that would be wasting the police's time. But it's always better to be overcautious of a situation and turn out to be wrong than to like plan for something and not have any caution at all, you know. But but it's all gonna turn out well. It's Nancy Drew. Nancy always wins in the end. She just suffers a lot beforehand. But anyway, we reached the hour point, and I hope you guys are ready for the next bit of Nancy Drew. Because it is going to be action packed. Thank you guys for listening / watching my beautiful slideshow over here. And I'll see you guys next time.